Thank you for joining. We will be starting at the top of the hour, just 2 minutes from now. We will be starting at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, More Secure Than Ever, Windows 10. Thanks for joining us today. I'm sure it'll be well worth your time. Over the past 2 years, Champion Solution Group has been helping multiple organizations migrate to Windows 10. Today, we're pleased to have one of our customers, Mark Falk from Cox Media Group, share his Windows 10 journey along with Dan Powers from Champion. I'm going to start with introductions. I'm Tammy Hope, Security Practice Lead at Champion. Mark Falk is the lead analyst on the Cox Media desktop team with approximately 6,000 endpoints across the U.S. He has a 30-plus year history as an IT professional with a career spanning micro, mini, and mainframe computers. He started in endpoint management in 1989. For those of you doing the math, that is from DOS to Win 10, Apple 5201, and OS X. He is also responsible for software installs, software deployment tools, system imaging, anti-malware, and antivirus solutions. He is also skilled in managing the user experience. What I really like is Mark's mantra: standardize, simplify, and automate. Our other speaker today is Dan Powers. Dan is the Senior Security Architect at Champion and the author of our IP and Proven Windows 10 migration process. Dan has been working within the IT industry since 1990 and at Champion Solutions Group since 2015. Before working for Champion, Dan is engaged at the following companies, architecting and implementing software solutions. He was at JP Morgan Chase, PayPal, eBay, MIT, Lincoln Labs, PepsiCo, and Tropicana, to name a few. Before I go over today's agenda, we want to make sure today's webinar hits the mark. So please enter your questions in the chat box. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we're able. If we don't get to all of the questions, we will send a follow-up to everyone with the answers. So please make sure you ask all your questions because we will make sure that they all get answered. So let me go over the agenda. I'm not seeing the agenda. Kevin, did you move forward?
It's there.
Thank you. Today's agenda, as you can see, we're going to go over what's driving customers to move to Windows 10, the obstacles that you need to overcome. We're going to talk about the different paths between BIOS and UEFI. Mark's going to talk about the lessons learned, and we'll talk to you a little bit about Microsoft funding to do Windows 10. Dan himself is really going to take a really comprehensive look at the roadmap that can be developed and help you get to the choices you want when you migrate. But before we go through the whole agenda, I'm going to turn this over to Kevin Vogel, and we're just going to do some polling questions so you all get a feel for where you are against each other as far as the process of a Windows 10 migration. Kevin?
Thanks, Tammy. And everyone, if you could not use the chat box, but use the question box. That way we actually can log questions. We can even answer them on air, or we can answer them in a reply to your question. The chat box is really used to talk in between, individuals. But I just wanted you to know that really the question box is the place to ask questions. So with that, I'm going to launch a couple of just quick questions here for you. Number one, and I'll launch it for you. What best describes your organization status with the Windows 10 migration? And I will click off that right now. And just so you know, we'll be letting you know how the thing goes. We usually run these for about 35, 40 seconds. And it looks like, about 50% of you so far have started your migration. And it looks like almost a third of you haven't even started yet. So just to give you some round ball numbers, and 28, 29% of you now completed your migration. So just give me a couple more seconds here. About 60% of you have voted so far. All right, so just so you know, 40% of you have started your migration, and 30 and 30 have either finished or not started your migration. I'm going to close that poll and go on to the next one. Approximately what percentage of your endpoints are still BIOS enabled? So I will start that poll right now. And with about 30% of you voting so far, 63% are BIOS enabled. 15% all endpoints are UEFI, and the rest are BIOS. So here, just 10 more seconds. We got about 50% of you have voted so far. So it looks like it's going to end up at 48% of you, or 50% are still BIOS enabled. 40% of you are 100% BIOS enabled, and everything else is UEFI. I'll close that poll, and we'll go on to the next. There's only two more quick questions. As you can see, these go by really fast. Has your organization considered security capabilities of Windows 10 endpoints? And we do these polls so that Mark and Dan and Tammy can make sure that they cover the areas that you want covered the most. And usually these poll questions actually help us, fine tune the presentation to make sure we cover those points. So with 38% of you voting, it looks like no, still need education. And 40% of you, yes, security benefits are definitely important. So there we go, just 5 more seconds. All right, we ended up at 42% and 42% no, still need education. 42% the security benefits are definitely important, and the rest we are staying with our current endpoint solution. So let's go on to the last question here. And what is your biggest single obstacle to Windows 10 for your organization? And as you can see, we have 4 answers to this one. Right now, it looks like no funding is the big winner here. Well, now it's starting to catch up with the other ones. Political is more than I thought we would get. Too resource consumptive, not enough IT resources is now 50% of the reason why you're not going to Windows 10 so far. So just a couple more seconds here. All right, so we're going to end up with too resource consumptive is 42%, No funding is 26%, too risky 21%, and political 11%. With that, I'll turn it back over to Tammy and let them get started.
Thanks, Kevin. Really appreciate that. Thanks for everyone that answered the poll questions. We will, as Kevin said, really concentrate on where you are in the rest of the webinar. So on this next slide, where are you in this journey? Dan, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to you to talk about who's driving the Windows 10 migration in an enterprise.
Yeah, greetings, everybody. So glad, first of all, thank you, everybody, that's in attendance today. And again, what we're accomplishing here in our limited time is to kind of give you some tips of different things that we've seen. Of course, Mark was going to be the main focus of this because he has been going through this migration as one of our clients very successfully. But the answer to you, Tammy, right? It's interesting how people answered some of those questions because it kind of goes into what we've been seeing. Of course, we know Windows 7 end of support, right? So we have the end user team obviously knows this project coming along. But the other thing that we've really seen kind of happen is, in a large portion, is the executive leadership and the security side of the house. That, you know, they're no longer looking at some of these endpoints that are out there, which make up usually 90% of their environment. Is that obviously your strength of security is only as strong as its weakest link. And Windows 10 in itself does offer us quite a bit of security features that we can take advantage of if we do the migration successfully and the right way, right? So cost has been a huge thing, and it's an interesting point of the poll questions that people had added cost in there and also lack of resources. And sometimes I look at those as, you know, kind of the same side of the coin, right? Cost to it obviously is going to be in manpower, not just the cost of, you know, licensing and all those good things. But on this slide we're seeing, and I'm not going to read this slide per se, but a couple of interesting points to me is a lot of people don't have a good plan as of yet. Again, going to the polling questions that we asked, we know that runway of getting to the end of support of Windows 7 is going to come up quick. And a lot of people don't have a firm grasp of that, have kind of been pushing this off for various reasons, cost being one. The other thing that's very interesting to me is those folks that did start the journey, not a lot of them have really successfully implemented all of the features that Windows 10, along with Azure and other things that Microsoft is giving you, kind of can help you really secure your environment. So to me, it's twofold. It's obviously, it's not just the desktop team, it's executives that are looking at this from the company standpoint, and definitely a heavy influence from security. So Mark, your point of view, is that what you guys seen from Cox Media?
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon to everyone who's on the webinar. That is some of what we've seen. Let me just give folks a little bit of background. Cox Media Group is a integrated media company, which means we're radio stations, TV stations, newspapers, and some other attendant businesses that fall in the media space. And we're diverse geographically across the country, 30 locations from coast to coast. So that's one of our challenges when we started looking at Windows 10. The other thing, due to the nature of our business, you can't gather news if you're sitting in an office. So you have to have people away from an office. Hundreds of our users and their computers or devices, whatever you may have, hardly ever touch our physical network. So we had to look at that when we were looking at endpoint security and a journey to Windows 10. So when we first looked at this process of how do we get to Windows 10, we realized it was going to be a big deal, a real major effort. What comes to mind is a forklift upgrade, or maybe a whole army of forklifts to do the upgrade. So we looked at that, did some estimates, got some input from some other entities on what they might be able to do to help us. And as a matter of fact, that's how we ended up partnering with Champion. But in round numbers, initial estimates were this was going to be north of about $500,000 to actually go through a migration, because what we were looking at, and I euphemistically call this the digital approach, and you're going to see why digital is a euphemism and probably way off the mark. When I'm talking about digital, I'm talking about using your digits, as in your fingers on the keyboard, to push an F key or escape or an Alt key to change some sort of BIOS setting. So what we realized was we could not do this at scale in our business with our geographic dispersion, with the number of folks that touch our network, and then again, the number that don't touch our network. We could not do this type of process and take advantage of the security aspects of Windows 10 without spending tons and tons, and I mean hundreds of man weeks of time to get this done, unless we could wrap some sort of automation around the process. So basically, we had to find a new process that would reduce the migration time, reduce the disruption and the impact to the end user, and produce some high quality results. And that here again is where we ended up kind of bumping into Champion. Now, thing to remember here is that in our business, just as I assume in there's all enterprises, you have to justify the spend on any IT project. So we needed to really wrap our arms around the benefits of Windows 10 and then present that as the reason why we wanted to go to Windows 10, why we wanted to have an automated process so that we could secure both buy-in and funding moving forward.
Hey, Mark, were
Yes.
you at, so you were at Cox for a while. Were you there while you did the XP to Windows 7 migration X years back?
Yes, and that unfortunately, that ended up being like a 4-year process. And that 4-year process was driven mostly by when you would do replacements. So we were on a 4-year replacement cycle. So every year it would be 25%. Now, of course, if you had like a break fix, you would advantage that time and flip somebody to XP, or maybe flip them to 7 if we're talking about the 7 process. But they both had like a 4-year duration to get there.
Okay, so you did it mostly through attrition. And
Right.
and again, part of what we're going to talk about here, and why we talked about UEFI before, and it was one of the polling questions. When you went from XP to Windows 7, obviously UEFI wasn't on your drawing board. And I know when we originally talked about your migration to Windows 10, you folks already knew, hey, we need to do this. So that was a huge difference, one of them, between the XP migration and the Windows 10 migration, right?
Right. So one of the things we looked at is, hey, there's all these security capabilities, and that is always an important point and somewhat of a selling point when you start dealing with executive leadership on a particular product or a particular OS. Is there has to be security benefits. We, like any other business, are concerned with security. We don't want a data breach. There's always the potential risk of a breach, and that brings some very bad things to your organization. No CIO or IT practitioner wants to be that face on TV if there's a breach. So any OS or any product that you particularly have, and I know we're talking about the Windows 10 OS, if it has some built-in security goodness, you want to take advantage of that. Another thing that we really have to embrace, I mean, realistically, as IT pros, we need to keep security foremost in our mind. If you don't, you really need to remember a key phrase. Do you want fries with that? So, as you move forward in this business, you just got to embrace all those security tools that are out there that help you manage your business and secure your endpoints. Now, our media business, we curate and create content from a variety of sources. That's our intellectual property. We need to make sure that property is secured because we don't want to lose that. Additionally, Our employees, as I said earlier, are remote. They're out in the field. They're gathering content. They're interviewing people, all those types of things. They're using multiple devices. I think the industry now says folks usually have 3 devices that they consume content or create content on. So there's that where you have to look at some sort of security feature. And in our business, in the media business, we are pushing ourselves more and more into the digital space. We want to win in the digital space because media is a highly competitive industry, and Windows 10 with its security features helps us in that digital space so that we can get there before our competitors, because that's always something that you want to do. And like Dan brought up, we had a difficult decision to make. We knew moving from UEFI or from BIOS to UEFI, along with Secure Boot, because that's what we did, was a complex and time-consuming process without the right tools and processes and procedures in place.
Well, that's excellent to move right into the next slide we have. So Kevin, if you want to forward off a little bit. Again, we're not going to do a deep dive into all these, right? Our focus is all around the Windows 10, but of course you can hear us all talking about security is obviously a big thing, from who's driving the Windows 10 movement to, as you heard Mark talking about, a customer that's doing it, going through it today. So if we look at this, to me, Microsoft has done quite a bit around security, right? And everybody is embracing security in these last couple of years. From their point of view, they kind of broke it out into 2 parts, right? We have our end user security and the infrastructure, right? So the infrastructure side is the operations management, and whether you're doing it in Azure, you're doing it on premise, you have a hybrid of that. A lot of the features, again, at the Windows Server 2016, and the flagship, server out there on Windows is the SQL Server, right? Their flagship app, if you will, from the infrastructure side. And really what Microsoft has kind of put their security hats on is in like 3 different protection key phases, right? So whether that's Office 365, Windows 10, Enterprise Mobile, and Security, is the advanced threat prevention, Windows Defender. Again, it comes with Windows 10, of course, and threat intelligence, right? These are the huge key pillars that they're looking at. And we're going to take a little deeper dive into the Windows 10 side of this, but to me, we couldn't go forward unless we at least brought some of this stuff up from this slide here. Again, this information is available on the website. Be glad to talk to you about it as well, but we're just trying to set the stage of scenario of where does Windows 10 fit into the Microsoft model. So if you wouldn't mind, Kevin, advancing to the next slide. And here now we're looking at, Windows 10, right? This is the little component in this security house that we're talking about, obviously the focus of today. And again, this is broken out into 2 different areas, right? We have 4 pillars here on the pre-breach side and 1 on the post-breach. Because let's face it, folks, most of us sooner or later, whether it's a major thing, whether you're, as Mark had said, on the Twitter headlines where you don't want to be trending that way. But a breach, something going wrong, is probably an inevitability at most point. So we do need the capabilities to detect, to figure out where it happened, to contain it. And Microsoft has done spent a decent amount of time and effort there to give us tools to do so. But of course, they're more concentrating on the pre-breach. What are all the things that we can do to harden our systems? I'm not going to read through all of these, but of course it goes about securing your identities, obviously protecting the data. That is really the most important thing, securing your devices. And that's where Windows 10 kind of really comes into play. The key part, or the key thing I'm trying to throw out here, is when we look at those color bars on top. We have the purple ones, if that color comes across to you as it does to me. These are the most secure features that you can enable. Blue is secure. It's not quite as secure as some of those other options. And of course, we get into that little gray, if you will, slate gray area that is available in Windows 10. A lot of those features are in Windows 8, Windows 7, coming just the operating system. The key point that I wanted to make here is that UEFI. So again, going back to some of those poll questions when we asked how many folks, know about UEFI, what is UEFI, what are the benefits of it? So without going into massive detail, we'll kind of talk about that right now. UEFI is not a Windows 10 thing. It's It's not a Microsoft thing either. It's an industry standard. Apple has been UEFI booted their devices for quite a while. Linux has the capability of doing it. It's really a hardware vendor specification. Microsoft as well takes advantage of this in Windows 10 and can offer you some advanced secure capabilities, such as market indicated, UEFI secure booting. For those folks who started your Windows 10 process or completed it even, if your systems are still booting into legacy BIOS, right, which, really the concept of BIOS hasn't changed since I was playing Space Invaders on my Atari. It's the same basic input-output system. UEFI is the new way of booting up your hardware so that you can be assured that advanced malware, advanced threats, persistent threats should at least have a very harder time or not be able to exist. So when we first gave these webinars, I could tell you that it did not exist in UEFI. However, there has recently, just so you know, has been the first found ever advanced persistent threat in the UEFI booting machine. But to note that all new security features and capabilities are really going to be based around machines booting UEFI. So again, things like Secure Boot, Device Guard, Credential Guard. If you folks are familiar with these and you're running your Windows 10 system and you're not booting from UEFI, you cannot turn those features on. They're unavailable to you, right? So that was some of the things that Mark had brought to our attention. And again, Mark, when we first engaged, you guys had already kind of understood that. And a lot of our other clients that we worked with, heard about Device Guard, Credential Guard, and these things. They didn't understand the impact of UEFI. And you guys knew that from day one, correct?
Right, and a lot of the things that we looked at with Windows 10 were all driven around taking advantage of UEFI and Secure Boot. Also, leveraging the trusted platform module, that chip on the motherboard, and then in turn being able to take advantage of some of those other features that were in Windows 10, like BitLocker and Device Guard and Credential Guard, and any of the features that were built into the operating system that would help us out, help us be more secure. And as I said earlier, so that we weren't that face on TV explaining what happened, you want to keep your data secure. You're hoping that your user base will assist you in that process, but they could get tempted to click on something in an email that is malicious and they don't know it. So anything that you can use that's inherent to the OS that'll help you out in that area, you want to use. Additionally, I just touched on BitLocker. BitLocker is a tool to encrypt the hard disk so that when your data is at rest, it's encrypted. That laptop can get left on the train, on the plane, in the coffee shop. You don't want somebody to pull some data off there if the device gets misplaced or mislaid or just outright stolen. So you've got to take advantage of any of those security tools that are available to you in the OS.
And when you did that XP to Windows 7 migration, Mark, let me ask you a quick question. How many of those hardware devices did you actually just update the BIOS versions on, or did you?
No, we just left it alone. That was not something that was basically in scope at that point in time. I really don't think there was a great deal of thought about updating BIOS to do anything. Mostly, updating BIOS has been a technician's troubleshooting tool when a customer, an end user experiences some sort of odd behavior. That's kind of in that tool set of things that you do.
Right. And we noticed, like, no, Microsoft website, Dell website, HP, all of them, the vendors will tell you when you're moving to Windows 10, they all recommend you update your BIOS. And another reason for that is what we've noticed going out there, exactly what Mark said. Most people don't update their BIOS, right, unless there's a specific reason. But this was a different hurdle when we're talking about the migration strategies to go to Windows 10. Everything you mentioned, BitLocker, for example, and to really get better encryption, if you have the hardware that has a TPM model on it, updating the BIOS can also update the specification of that TPM so we can do stronger encryption. And again, some systems that we've done, their original BIOSes that they were working with actually did not support UEFI or Secure Boot. We had to update their BIOS just to be able to get into a position where we could actually enable UEFI. So that's where we coined the phrase where we came down to a desired state. And there can be multiple versions of this. You can expand upon it, but what we looked at it was Windows 10. We also want to be 64-bit, not 32-bit, and at least be booting in UEFI. I don't have to turn on Secure Boot, Credential Guard, all those other things. I can do it later, but only if I'm at least booting UEFI, and then I can turn those things on, right? So I think we all agree to that. So again, from a security point, so Kevin, could you advance the slide? And again, this is just going, I'm gonna let Mark talk about this. These are some data points we pulled, right? What does it cost to keep a device? What's total cost of ownership? The cost, and again, these data points are out there. 6-7 years ago, when people moved from XP to Windows 7, what was the cost of PCs? And again, the points that Mark is making and I'm trying to reemphasize is we can look at what happened 7 years ago, and we can look at that Windows 10 adoption and say, well, there's a couple different hurdles to go across. Also, one of the things I mentioned just there was 32-bit version of the OS versus 64-bit version of an OS. If you XP to Windows 7, a lot of folks did an Inplace upgrade. It's quicker, it's faster, it's safer. However, if you're running a 32-bit version of your operating system, we can't do an Inplace upgrade and make it to a 64-bit operating system. 7 years ago, it wasn't that big of a deal. But in today's world, most of our new apps are all 64-bit. They run faster, they run quicker, and some of them don't even support 32-bit anymore. And of course, that we keep dancing around here is the BIOS versus UEFI. So let me ask you that question, Mark, for Cox Media. Again, we talked about UEFI and so forth, but your applications, do you have any like tricks, insight as you did this migration as far as applications around Windows 10? Did obviously move those to 64-bit?
We didn't notice any oddities when we moved to 64-bit. One of the beauties of going to 64-bit is it supports more than 4 GB of RAM. I mean, that was a big deal. If you're in a graphics intensive business, you need that. So in our business, 64-bit was really welcomed because the applications that we use for graphic design and media rendering and all those things really needed to take advantage of that 64-bit architecture. BIOS to UEFI, that's under the covers. Nobody even notices that. That's not something that even enters in anyone's mind, because the end user just sees that GUI that they deal with. So to us, the big deal was that migration from 32 to 64-bit, that let us give the users a better computing experience than they had before with 32-bit, which had a limit of 4 GB of RAM. So once we pushed past that was a real boon to our users.
Okay, excellent. So Kevin, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And there's a reason why we talked.
Well, Dan, we got a couple of questions if you don't mind. Thomas asked, does the changing from BIOS to UEFI increase your boot time at startup?
It actually, your booting time is much faster under UEFI enabled computers. So is hibernation, sleep, and all of that. Moving under UEFI, the other thing to remember, it's not just the hardware itself. And it's kind of like your phone that boots up, right? Most people that, whether you're an Android user or an iPhone, you heard of jailbroken or rooted. And in BIOS mode, again, that's where some of those threats were. In UEFI, it's kind of starting a chain of trust. So that's where the security comes from. And it also reformats how the hard drive is laid out. So the old way is MBR, the new one is GPT. That is also leads to some of the booting being much, much quicker. We've definitely noticed it on same hardware, whether you're booting Windows 7 or Windows 10, BIOS versus UEFI, whether it's a cold boot, whether it's coming out of a hibernation, a power sleep, or whatever, you're going to get a much, much more responsive device under UEFI than you do BIOS.
All right, and one other question. Janet asked, Mark, is there a secret to automate remote users' workstations?
Good question. I am assuming I'm going to answer it this way. We're talking about automating working on a remote user's workstation for the purpose of the upgrade.
Yes.
Let me say that we have tried that, and depending upon bandwidth, you've got two forks you can go down here. If you have a good, rich bandwidth connection to that remote user system, you can do the automated upgrade that you're looking for remotely. If the bandwidth is not so good, it's extremely painful. And if the process goes south, you may not be able to do a recovery. So the idea is, if you can, dispense with the remote upgrade and try to get them, physically connected to your network. It's safer for them, it's safer for their data, and usually it's a much better experience on both sides of the equation there, for the IT person and for the end user.
Yeah, and I follow up, and I agree with Mark there. Remote just sometimes can mean different things to different folks. We're both assuming when you say remote, it's somebody at home, right? It's not a remote office, right? Because there's ways, obviously, even if the pipe from your headquarters to a remote office is small, but you're talking to a remote office, there's obviously ways to keep the automation in place, and it'll run fast. Your other option as well, as Mark had indicated, is offline media. If you get some of the automation process down in place, can you create bootable USB sticks? Can you create CD-ROMs with your image, your stuff inside of it, and take care of that? That is correct. But Mark has an excellent point of, if something does go wrong, obviously we can't reach out and touch them, right? So multiple factors there, network bandwidth being a huge one.
Right.
All right, Dan, that's all I have for you.
Okay, so if you would go to the next slide. So again, we set up a lot of these things, and what we're looking at next is it an in-place upgrade, or do we wipe the device, right? And this is going to all tie back in together with Mark's point about what the cost was going to be when he said it was going to be a digit experience, right? A lot of hands on the keyboard. And if we can overcome some of these hurdles with automation, this is where we can offset time and cost. So an in-place upgrade, of course, has pros to it. It's faster and easier. We're going to take whatever machine you have today, and we're going to in-place upgrade it to Windows 10, whether that's Windows 7 or Windows 8. There's no user state migration. Their files, their data that's there is going to stay. It's obviously less expensive if we're doing this on a manual way. The cons, of course, as we've mentioned, if you're a 32-bit version of Windows 7, Windows 8, well, guess what? You're going to be a 32-bit version of Windows 10. Obviously, that can have bad effects as far as applications and performance, right? Plain and simple. The other thing that we had mentioned is BIOS and UEFI. Doing that in-place upgrade, if you're currently in BIOS mode, you're going to be in BIOS mode running Windows 10. If your goal is to take advantage of some of those extra security features, you will not be able to do so, such as secure boot. The other thing we notice as well in different clients that we worked with is existing problems. Let's face it, love Windows operating system. All operating systems have some of their issues, installing up things, removing them, registries getting corrupted, MOF files, all of these little things. If there's problems on the existing box, some of those problems are going to move with you into the Windows 10 world. Now we look at the fresh install, and of course we have pros and cons here as well. We obviously can switch if they're 32-bit to 64-bit, where we want to be. It's our desired state, so that the OS and software we put back on is 64-bit. The other nice part about that, which we didn't talk about, but from the software standpoint, is everywhere we've gone, people have various versions of software, right? Multiple versions of Java and Adobe and whatever it is. If we go the fresh install route, we're reinstalling the OS, the OS and the apps, but all the machines at the end of that, line cycle, if you will, are going to be identical. There's going to be the same versions of software, and we should be able to maintain that going forward. Of course, we can make that switch from BIOS to UEFI. If we do so, we can take advantage of all those great Windows 10 security features. And as mentioned before, if there are some existing problems, which could even be bad sectors on a hard drive over time, when it gets reformatted, they get mapped out. You're really kind of eliminating those problems that were existing on that device before we touched it in the first place. Of course, the cons, it is longer. It's a longer process. Before automation, it would have been a manual effort and therefore cost a lot more. We do have to redeploy software, and we have to back up the user state and restore it. But if we can wrap automation around this, and Mark, I'll let you jump in here, we really can take this down where it's now click of a button. And quite honestly, going from an in-place upgrade, which again, depending on your bandwidth network hardware, is anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour, right, to do that, versus doing the whole automated fresh install, which you're talking about 90 minutes or maybe slightly over. It's not a lot of time given the benefits. And your opinion on that, Mark, fresh install versus in place?
Well, it's one of those typical IT questions. It's an it depends type thing. It depends upon, as you indicated before, what your path is, what your bandwidth is, what the apps are. All those types of things kind of fall into that equation. For us, we wanted to be UEFI enabled. Hands down. We wanted to get to that point. We wanted to take care of the new model that was there in the underlying hardware of the particular desktop, laptop, whatever the workstation was. We wanted to take advantage of some other security features that we couldn't take advantage of if we were BIOS. So that was basically a desired state to us. One of the things we had to consider, without getting in, too much into the technical weeds of things, is if we go with UEFI, we have to go to GPT disks or GUID partition table disks. You can't do that without reformatting a disk. So if you go to GPT, that's a one-way ticket. Then you've got to figure out, okay, if I'm going to go through this process of moving to UEFI from BIOS, and I have to reformat the user's disk, what am I going to do with their data? What am I going to do with that user state? So as you brought up there in the cons, yeah, there are some things that you have to consider, but to get to that security state that you want, you have to bite the bullet and say, we're going to have to do item A, we're going to have to move from BIOS to UEFI. We're going to have to do item B, we're going to have to change the disk geometry and configuration, and we're going to have to do item C, which is we're going to have to do something with the user state before we even start this process. So in my mind, it's kind of a hybrid between in-place upgrade and fresh install when you're going through that particular set of requirements, Dan.
Okay, great. And Kevin, that's perfect. So let's go to the next slide because that reiterates just what Mark was talking about, right? So from a visual standpoint, if we look at this, we have our desired state, 64-bit, Windows 10, UEFI enabled, and in Mark's case, they wanted to take advantage of secure boot. So some of the things we had to look at, right, that we didn't necessarily have to deal with before was BIOS. Is it compatible? Do we have to upgrade it? 64 bits, 32-bit. And as Mark is showing, as we make this move over from the old machine to the new machine, we had to be able to take that user profile, capture it to start our process, be able to restore it on the other machine. And the same idea with those applications, right? And again, we can move them from 32-bit to 64-bit up to new versions, keeping everything consistent. But those are all the steps. So we knew the hard part, we knew the steps we had to overcome, and now it was, can we automate this, right? Because this process, as Mark had indicated, going from the one type of partition MBRT to GPT is a destructive process. So that'll go right into our next slide, if you wouldn't mind fast forwarding for me, Kevin, is we had to get a real good understanding of what our current state is. You may have to hit your mouse. There you go. So we have our operating systems, right? What are the OSs that are out there? What are we dealing with? What is our hardware vendors and models, right? So the more dispersed your hardware is, obviously the harder some of this is going to be. If you hit your button again, Kevin, we're going to look at some of the other three pieces. Again, we talked about BIOS. This wasn't a big deal in the XP to Windows 7, but as we're start talking about Windows 10, Mark wanted to get to UEFI. He wanted to make sure he took care of BitLocker, TPM. This dictated that we had to go look at all the BIOS versions. We had to start updating all the BIOSes on those devices long before we started our Windows 10 process. And we also had to look at installed apps. What are the apps that we have to package? What are the apps that might be 32-bit? We're going to repackage 64-bit. Again, part of our goal was to save on some of the software and get those machines in a very consistent state. You'll also notice up here, this is not a technical requirement, warranty information. Why did we collect that data? Well, in Mark's case, when we first started this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, it was one of those ideas of, hey, if the devices can't support Windows 10 from a hardware perspective, we're just going to buy new hardware, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, but that can be expensive when you start looking at it. Why we grabbed warranty was if the machine still has maybe a year or two left under its warranty and we get the details of why the machine can't move to Windows 10, maybe it needs a stick of memory, maybe it needs a new video card. These are the little things we found. And from a business decision, it made more sense to go spend that capital, which was much less than a brand new PC, to have that hardware keep its life cycle for another year or two. So next set of data points, and there's, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind clicking one more time for me, thank you, sir. A couple other things that we looked at. So for those folks starting this journey, and there's more stuff we looked at, but we highlighted a few, is the users on the endpoints and the size of their profiles. So again, as we indicated, if we're wiping a device, we got to capture your user profile. We have to store this on the network somewhere. We go through the whole process of making your machine into the desired state, and we obviously want to restore the user profile into place. So that the user is happy, right? Because that's a huge thing we haven't even touched on, was the end user experience. We can have a technical, great migration, but if our end users are not happy or not trained on Windows 10 before you switch them over, you'll have unsatisfied users. But what we looked at here is the size of profiles. When we first started this, I assumed profile user space would be 1 or 2 gigabytes in size. After having done quite a few of these migrations, that is simply not the case. And what we find is, the average user profile is somewhere between 5 to 9 gigabytes in size. And then after that, the complex range is just huge. So, and we noticed that in your environment, right, Mark, as far as the profile sizes, did that surprise you?
To some extent, yes. We saw some of our users with 100+ gigabyte user profiles. Now, they were photogs, they were graphics people, they stuffed everything on their desktop or maybe in their My Documents or whatever, but they were just huge. And of course, that has an effect on user experience when they start up the machine, if it's going to load in that profile. But, when we looked using the reports provided to understand our environment, we've got, how big is this elephant type of thing? We've got 6,000 plus endpoints. We need to understand what all those different models are that we have in our environment. In our case, I believe we came up with 50 different models of desktop and laptop. When you look back, our journey started in 2016, early 2017. So we're talking about models going back to 2013 or maybe even 2012. So there was just a great deal of variation there. Some of those machines, our current hardware manufacturer didn't support drivers for Windows 10, and we're not going to support drivers for Windows 10. So part of that understanding of our environment was, is this machine able to go to Windows 10? So right. If it was not, we have to figure out how we move forward there. Also, we had thousands of applications. I believe, Dan, the number was 20,000, and then we had to normalize that down to a smaller number than that, or maybe it was 30,000. All I know is it was big.
Yep, it certainly was.
And then getting to that small number helped us figure out, okay, we want to normalize all these applications that we have. Maybe it's just multiple versions of the same thing, like a Java or an Adobe or a Creative Suite, something or other.
Hey, Mark, I'm gonna
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna interrupt you just for a second. I'm getting the timer. Hey, we got to keep moving along. So
okay.
Apologize, my friend. But at the end of the day, Mark's point is real. Kevin, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide. what we're looking at, Mark's perfectly, right? It was the data. It was that pre-assessment. It was what is out there. We defined the desired state. We knew where we wanted to go. At this point, whether it was working with Mark at Cox Media and the other clients we worked with, was we needed to really understand where we were today to get to where we need to go. And this is why we do those pre-assessments, right? This is why we collect a lot of data points that we keep adding to over time, simply because, things that I did not think would affect my user state, my Windows 10 migration, for example, warranty, for example, those profile sizes, right? Those are things I didn't expect as we went forward here. So we really take a lot of effort to get all these data points so that we could make the correct technical and business decision to move forward, right? So Kevin, if you wouldn't mind moving forward one more slide. And again, I'm going to go through these fairly quick now. Realize that the time is getting away on us. Here's just some more examples of some of the data that we're trying to collect. Everything about the hardware. And again, if we're going through this, we talked about BIOS. It's what are we going to do with Windows 10 after it's up and running? BitLocker, as Mark had indicated, BitLocker to go. Well, to make that work the best as possible, I want to make sure I have TPM configured. I'd updated the BIOS to the new version. I want to make sure it's activated or not. There's a lot of things to understand. There's a lot of things that you do need to do. And for those of you that have not started this yet, your runway to 2020 for the year is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and you really do need to take advantage of the resources out there, whether that's Microsoft, Champion, somebody else, some of the funding and so forth, and move forward with this. So Kevin, if you wouldn't mind moving forward again, and again, I'm just doing this because of time-wise. Over the time, and Mark and Cox Media and Cox Enterprises has been great to work with as a partner. We keep modifying what we do. For example, we were talking about it, where we really need to uncover what your current Windows environment is. We obviously want to start working in multiple branches, right? One of those being your application. As Mark had indicated, very complex news organization that covers newspapers, media all around the country. They literally did have thousands and thousands and thousands of applications. Large part of that was because of same app, multiple versions, all these different reasons, but that was a huge thing to tackle. And to get under control. The benefit of that, most customers we dealt with, is at the end of the day, taking that time to do so not only helps your Windows 10 migration, but it can actually help you moving forward with slimming down the support of software that you're actually running in your environment. Obviously, test and design your deployment image, right? And perform a good POC in your environment. And make sure that we get some user testing and some users education. Again, I had mentioned, I've been on a project where from a technical aspect, we were almost flawless. Nothing ever goes flawless, but we did darn good. But because we didn't engage the end users, because we didn't provide them some training, the end user experience, however, was not rated high at all. And I felt we failed a little bit. So don't forget to do that as well. And that's where we get to that deployment and mentoring standpoint, not just your IT staff, not just to help them get over the technical capabilities, but your end users, the folks that are going to get their new machine running Windows 10 and wonder where the start menu went, right? We all heard those type of jokes. So Kevin, if you wouldn't mind moving ahead a little bit.
Dan, let me interject here. I don't think I can stress enough that the application normalization and testing all around doing your Windows 10 migration is really important. We chewed up like 6 or 8 weeks on that.
Yep, absolutely. And I remember that quite well. Now, let me ask you a quick question on that, Mark, and just remember we're running out of time and I want you to talk about your other slides here. But at the end of the day, you talked about having that huge number of applications. In your mind, this year, next year, going forward, spending that time doing it, do you feel like you have a better control of your software and possibly even maybe spend less money in licensing? Or
yeah, it did help with licensing. The big benefit's going to be, okay, we're now at a standard point in time. We can deal with updates going forward rather than trying to handle multiple updates. Maybe you can just do 1 or 2 updates of a version.
Excellent point. So multiple benefits for it.
Right.
All right, this slide's all you, Mark. I'm going to be quiet.
Okay. Well, talking about time is money and how we did things in Cox Media Group, you know, when we did this migration, our CIO announced this to the company that we were going to be doing this starting in early 2017. We did a little bit of a pilot, and we had some ideas very early on that this is going to take a really big training initiative, web-based training, some video snippets, leave behind documents, job aids, all sorts of stuff like that. We started getting feedback from technicians after they had done some pilot deployments. Specifically, I remember talking to one. He said he sat down and he did a complete dog and pony show to the user about Windows 10 versus his Windows 7 environment, all those type of things. The user said, "Great, I got it at home. It's not going to be a problem." And that information got back. So that really changed how we were going through this particular process. So we ended up with just a leave behind, and a lot of time that just gets chucked. Communicate to your users. You're going to find out, if you communicate to them and with them, you'll find out that they've got this stuff at home. I mean, heck, my 80-plus-year-old grandmother's got Windows 10, or mother's got Windows 10 at home. So one of the other things that you're going to find out is that as you start getting more and more Windows 10 rolled out, you're going to get OS envy, as I call it, because that user that has Win 10, that person that's sitting in the cube next to him or on the work table next to him is going to want to get that same shiny new OS that this person Windows 10 has. So, depending upon your scale and number of systems to migrate and all those type of things you might have to consider, maybe there needs to be some PM things wrapped around your particular project. We did use that, and it aided, keeping executive leadership updated on what we were doing as far as the upgrade process goes. And I talked on apps earlier. It's really important to work on those apps to make sure that they're tested in 10. You get yourself standardized, because you're going to reap benefits going further forward from there. And you got a plan, stick to it. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Mark. I
Thanks,
appreciate
Mark.
that insight. And Kevin, can you go to the next slide? I think, Tammy, you're going to cover from this part.
Yeah, I'll take it from here, folks. And Dan mentioned this before, that it's not just about moving to Windows 10, but can you get the end user trained? And won't spend a lot of time here, but Champion does provide that. We can help you with your user adoption and have things like assessments, automated workflows, education classes, and even ongoing help for your users. So something to think about. There's a URL there. It's pretty simple to take a look at that, because it is a key. It's one thing to migrate. It's another thing to get the user adoption. So Kevin, we can go to the next one. I know we're running out of time, as everybody said. But at the end of the day, Champion wants to help you reach your desired state through automation. It'll enable you and your company to follow your standards, compliancy, whether it's security or operational. It really will get you to a better place than you are today. And then I'll go ahead and go to the next slide as we continue to wrap up here. And just wanted to once again put together the fact that there is the readiness assessment that we talked about very early on. I think what our customers have done is one of two things. They use the readiness assessment to get all the information they want so that they can move forward on their own, or they select Champion to help them with that if they don't have the cycles. I think we go back to the beginning. A lot of people haven't started just because there's either other projects in the way, and we're there to help if you need it. And more importantly, Microsoft is funding a lot of this. So we go to our Microsoft colleagues and can help you get the funding. And it's just another service that we can provide you. And we're happy to do so if needed. I'm going to wrap up on this next slide. The Q&A slide. Does anybody have any questions for us? We've got some things for you here as far as spots. We talked about the readiness assessment, Microsoft funding. You can go to our website. A lot of the things we talked about, there's articles, UEFI, if you're still a little confused what it is versus BIOS. We put a lot of that educational information out there for you as well. We will be sending the slides to everybody today. We will, as soon as this is over, pull for the winner of the GoPro Hero. And you've got our 800 number if you want any more information. And last but not least, I think we have one last polling question that Kevin's going to take. So put out there. Thank you to everyone. We tried not to go long. I think we made it with a couple minutes, but we hope this was very educational for all of you today. And if there's anything you need and we can help, we'd be happy to do it.
And we have launched the poll, Tammy, and it says, do you want to take advantage of our Windows 10 adoption readiness assessment? But I do have a couple questions here. One for Mark, and this comes from Don. Don asked, Mark, what did you do with the applications that couldn't go to Windows 10?
In our particular case, we didn't find anything that couldn't go to Windows 10. Now, we had some things that didn't go to Windows 7, and we had to create some VMs for folks way back then. So we left those there in those particular cases because we knew if it couldn't do Windows 7, it couldn't do Windows 10. So that's how we particularly answered that.
All right, and then the last question is, when you're rolling out or when you're replacing, the desktops that couldn't go to Windows 10, how did you extract the profile information to reapply it to a new desktop?
We use the tool from Microsoft that they provide freely. It's in the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit called the ADK, which is USMT. Now, that same feature of USMT, which stands for User State Migration Tool, is built into the IBM Big Fix Lifecycle module.
Yeah, and Kevin, we've used that in multiple stances and at Mark's area as well, not just for the migration, but even a perfect example is, break fix, new user, right? New hire or whatever. The automation that we built out, and that was another goal Mark definitely had during this was, hey, we're building this, we're putting a lot of effort into it, but I'd really like to utilize what we built, the workflows and tools for other purposes. For example, a break fix or swapping to new hardware.
Yeah, exactly, Dan. We didn't want to keep recreating the same thing over and over again.
All right, with 1 minute left here, Mark, do you have any closing statement?
Other than the fact that if you haven't gone to Windows 10, you need to start moving like last month or 3 months ago or 6 months ago. But big thing is look at your apps, settle on some standards.
Okay, great. And Dan, any closing statement?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kevin. I was muted because I'm in a bigger room. Closing statement, folks. Again, this was a high level, intended to be kind of a roadmap. We do have a lot of information on the website. For those of you that are starting this process, I hope we gave you some key points to look at, right, that you may not have considered. For those of you that are in the middle of it, again, hopefully that you will be taking a serious look at UEFI, the benefits from that going forward. My take of it, that is going to be huge if you're any organization like, has to do PCI, HIPAA, those type of things. I got to assume secure booting and some of these advanced features will end up being into some of those requirements. So put yourself in a position to take advantage of them. And that simply moving to UEFI would be my biggest takeaway from this.
All right, well, thanks everyone for attending, and we will be putting these slides together with a rebroadcast of this webinar, and we'll be sending you those links within the next couple of business days. Thanks, and have a great day.